right, we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DNA Basics. We'd like to start by introducing ourselves. My name is Alexis, and we also have Malin with us today. Before we get started, we just wanted to go over some Zoom features with you guys. Your mic and video have been muted and turned off. You will be able to use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. If you select the chat icon, a box should pop up over to the side. If you have any questions, we do ask that you type it into the chat, as we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. In today's presentation, we're going to look at the basics of DNA, what it is, and how you can use it to further your understanding of your family tree and ancestry. Before we get started, we'd like to state that we are not experts, rather that this presentation will serve as an introduction to these topics. Again, if you have any questions, we do ask that you hold them until the end. Oops, 1 second. Oops. All right, so we will get started today with the definition of DNA. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, is a molecule that is found inside human cells that contains a blueprint for your development and function. It is made up of 23 chromosome pairs for 46 total chromosomes. That includes the complete genetic information that make you, you. So your DNA includes a roadmap for all your genes, from your hair and eye color to your predisposition to certain diseases. So DNA is made up of molecules called nucleotides. These molecules include nitrogen bases, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. The order of these nitrogen bases in the DNA sequence form genes, which are the instructions for your DNA expression. All humans share 99.9% of DNA. However, it is the order of these nucleotide bases that gives us the variation between individual people. These genes are passed from parent to offspring through their chromosomes. They contain the genetic history of your ancestors, and the variations are how we determine the relationships between people.
So what makes up DNA? DNA has 23 pairs of chromosomes, 22 pairs of autosomal chromosomes, and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. You receive half of your DNA from your mother and half from your father. Each set of DNA also contains the inherited DNA from their parents and their parents' parents, and so on. Autosomes are the non-sex chromosomes that control the gene expression of an organism's characteristics. These 22 chromosomes code for a variety of features in both your phenotype, so observable characteristics like hair color or eye color, and genotype, the genetic composition of a person. The sex chromosome is the 23rd chromosome pair. They are similar to the 22 autosomal chromosomes. However, they code for male and female characteristics. Females have 2 X chromosomes, one from their mother and one from their father. And males have 1 X chromosome that they receive from their mother and 1 Y chromosome that they receive from their father. Genealogy is the study of one's family tree and ancestry. This method of tracking family history has been used most often. This is typically traced through archives and documentation throughout history. An example of this might be a birth certificate or a draft record from World War II. More recently, genetic genealogy has become accessible to the general population through at-home DNA tests. Genetic genealogy is a genealogy method that uses DNA testing to determine the genetic relationship between individuals by comparing their DNA sequences. There are 3 types of DNA that you can use to test your genetic lineage. As a reminder, females have 2 X chromosomes, one from their mother and one from their father, and males have 1 X that they receive from their mother and 1 Y that they receive from their father. A mitochondrial DNA test tests the DNA that is inherited from your maternal, so your mother's line. Only females pass on mitochondrial DNA to their offspring. However, both male and female children receive this DNA and can test for it. An XDNA test, this is DNA again inherited on the X chromosome from your father, and only females have XDNA, so that's what the XDNA test will test. And then the Y-DNA test will test that Y-DNA lineage that is inherited from the paternal line, and only males have Y-DNA.
All right, so right here we have a fan chart. So we're gonna go over how to read a genetic fan chart so that you understand exactly who's gonna be where, on what side, and what their relationship is to you when you're looking at these. So here in the center, this complete circle, that is going to be you or whoever has been tested. So if you test a parent, that would be them in the center, and so on. So right here is you. And then this next outer ring right here, it's split down the middle with this line here. And that's going to be important, that thicker black line, because that's going to represent your parents. And on a genetic fan chart, the mother side is always going to be on the right, and the father side is always going to be on the left. So it's going to be mother here and father here. So as we go up, they each have a set of parents, which would be your grandparents. So if we look here, these 2 circles right here, or these 2 rungs here, are going to belong to your mother's side here. Anything on this side of that black line is mother. Anything on this side of the black line is your father. So these 4 are your grandparents. These 8 are your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth through great-grandparents, 3 times great-grandparents, 4 times, and 5th times. They can continue to go on past the 5th great-grandparents, but this is just the basic one that we typically use most often. And sometimes you might not even be able to go up as far as the 5 times. It just depends on how well you've already plotted out your family tree, how much you know about people and what side they fall under, and if they've DNA tested as well. So all of those are going to be components into whether or not this is going to be, how well this is going to be filled out. But right is mother, left is father. So we'll move on to our first DNA chart that we're going to explain. And this is going to be the more simpler DNA fan chart. This is for Y-DNA. And like we mentioned earlier, Y-DNA is DNA that is inherited from your paternal or father's line. And only sons are going to receive that Y-DNA. So what that means is that since it is a son-specific DNA, it's going to pass from father to son, from father to son, so on and so forth down the line. And that DNA is going to essentially be a carbon copy from a parent to a son. And it'll continue to follow that path. So that's how you'd read it. Any colors can be used for this fan chart, but it's important that you make sure you only use 2 so that you can keep track of who's who in what side. Here we go. So we have, like I said, the left side of every rung, as you can see here. Here would be the paternal great-grandparent, and here's or grandmother. This is the grandfather. So son, father, grandfather, all the way down. So we'll move on to another one, and this one's going to be a bit more colorful. This is going to be that mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is that DNA that is inherited on your maternal line. This DNA can only be passed on to children from their mothers. So any X that is inherited from their mom is going to be that mitochondrial DNA. The XDNA that you receive from your dad is a completely different type of X. So it's not going to be shown on this chart. So however, you might notice that this one is a bit more colorful, and that's because in mitochondrial DNA, you're receiving DNA from more than just one side. So if we look at this here, what I mean by side is everything is going to remain on this mother's side, and it's going to be the exact same DNA, whether it is a male child or a female child. As you can see here, they're the exact same chart, except for the circle in the middle. But what we can see here is we have the mother side colored in, and here we have her parents, and here we have 3/4 of the grandparents listed. And the reason we don't have this one here is because this white area here is going to be that Y DNA that we saw on the last slide, from the grandfather passing it on to the father. And as the mom does not receive any of that, that's going to be left white. So as we can see here, there's going to be a couple of those columns shown. But everything here, all these generations back, these are the DNA that is going to be passed down and eventually show up here in the original tester. So if you match with someone on that mitochondrial DNA line, it's going to be with one of these ancestors, the ones that are colored in. So like we mentioned, here we have DNA that you receive from your father, and that is going to be the XDNA, and that's going to be passed on through that second X chromosome that's passed on from father to daughter. And this is a DNA inheritance that only a daughter would receive. So we have a daughter here in the center who was tested, and on this chart we have the father's side filled in. And so that XDNA is going to contain the DNA from her father's mother, so her grandmother, her grandmother's parents, and their parents, and so on and so forth. Now, something unique to the X chromosome is going to be the recombination of DNA. So whenever we look at X's being passed on from parent to child, we have to also mention that as X chromosomes move from parent to child, the mitochondrial DNA, so the maternal X, and the XDNA, so that father's X, can combine to become a new mitochondrial DNA. And a way to kind of explain that is, let's say you buy a brand new car. And that car, you were the first person to drive it, you're the only person to drive it, and you have a whole host of memories and experiences in that car, and you can see all of those show up in your car. Let's say a crayon melted in the cup holder, and it's in there forever, you can't get it out. So once you're done driving that car and you decide to pass it on to your daughter, she's going to inherit all of your mitochondrial DNA. But if her dad was a passenger in your car, he's going to have all of his little things on that side, and she's also going to inherit all the experiences from that driver. So by the time she inherits that X, there's going to be multiple sets of experiences in that car. And it's going to be a new car to her, just like it's going to be a new X to her, but it's going to have a combination of the maternal X and that paternal X to be taken in and be her new X. And the same thing will happen as it's passed on to her daughter and her children. So some of the reasons you might want to use DNA in your family history and ancestry research is that it can help you break down walls to find answers where a paper trail might not exist. Oftentimes, records are not available for certain people in your family tree, or you might not have been able to locate a relative yet. The DNA connection can bridge that gap and help to fill in some missing pieces. DNA connections can help to confirm the relationship between two people or families. If they match through DNA, then more likely than not, there is a genetic relationship there. You can learn about your ancestry and ethnical background through DNA testing. Many DNA companies are able to pinpoint the geographic and ethnic background through their tests. And the more people a company has tested, the more accurate the test results will be. So if they have a whole bunch of people who've tested in Ireland and you have a trace of Irish ancestry in your lineage, they might be able to pinpoint what neighborhood or area you originated from in Ireland based on how many people have tested from there. DNA can also help to locate the biological relatives of adoptees or people who don't know their parentage. Many times connections are discovered through relatives that can lead to biological parents and other family. DNA is a great way to verify ancestral lines found through paper records. And while paper documentation is a great place to work from, DNA provides other strong means to finding that proof of relationship. So if you've worked out that you and your cousin are related on a paper trail, but you want to make sure, you can DNA test to make sure that there are connections and that one or another relative wasn't adopted earlier down the line. This would just prove that that is a strong DNA relation. Sometimes paper research can be a little tricky to decipher. For example, a last name that has always been considered German might actually be Russian, which can be corrected through that DNA ethnicity mapping. Or another example is that a many times great uncle might have been placed under the wrong side of the family tree. He might have been, you thought he might have been related to you through your mother's side, but he was actually on your father's side. So you can often do this through targeted testing, which is a topic we cover in our more in-depth classes, which are advanced DNA classes, and those will happen throughout the year. But you can purposefully choose people to test in your family tree to determine where in their lineage they belong. So if you have a third cousin and you have no idea how you're related to them, you can test them and test you yourself and a couple other people and make sure that he does match up on that line where you think he belongs. Let's see. And then a lineage is the lineal descent from an ancestor. In this case, there are a couple different types of lineages. There's the matrilineal line, which is the lineage from female ancestors on the mother's line, which is only the female ancestors. So matrilineal is only going to be the females. And the maternal is the lineage related through the mother's line. So that's going to include both male and female ancestors that are related through the mother. And then patrilineal is the lineage from a male ancestor on the father's line. And those are only going to be male descendant or ancestors. Paternal is the lineage related through the father's line, which includes those male and female ancestors that are related to your father. You can use DNA to test for different lineages. Y-DNA can be used to track down a male line throughout a family tree so long as that DNA is uninterrupted and passed on in every generation. And then XDNA can be used to track down the maternal branch through the matrilineal line.
How does a DNA test work? Well, DNA tests can be purchased through different companies. The user will provide a sample to a DNA testing company, and they will run the autosomal, mitochondrial DNA, or Y-DNA test on the sample, depending on the test you choose. Most companies run an autosomal test. Other companies offer more specific tests like that Y-DNA or the XDNA. They'll upload the sample to their database, and matches and other information will be determined by comparing the tested DNA against other samples. These DNA samples are measured against each other using centimorgans. A centimorgan is a unit of measurement for DNA. It tells you how much DNA you share with another person. The higher your centimorgan count is, the more closely related you are to your genetic match. The different amounts of centimorgans correspond to genetic distance. So the more centimorgans you have in common with another person, the more closely related you are to them. This chart organizes this information by generation. While the amount of shared centimorgans helps determine the relationship between two people, it isn't always a clear label of relationship. But for example, you could share 75 centimorgans with another person that you have a match with. However, that shared amount of DNA segment means that the person could be your second or third cousin, or possibly even a third cousin twice removed. So the prediction of relationship isn't always clear because of the overlap in the prediction of in the relationship range. And it doesn't necessarily tell you what genetic line it falls under. So again, you could be, it could be a second cousin twice removed, or it could be a half-third cousin twice removed. So due to this overlap, it often helps to have your genealogical family tree to refer to when you're assessing your genetic family tree, as the former might help to legitimize that prediction of relationship. So when you consent to having your DNA tested, there are several things you should consider. You may find out that a person in your genealogical tree is not genetically related to you. Cases of adoption and illegitimate children have been disclosed, and this could be information that is revealed. So tying into this, DNA tests may also disclose information about non-paternal events. For example, you could receive information that determines that your father, whom you believe to be your biological father, is not genetically related to you. Name changes can reveal surname and first name lineage. For example, a distant genetic relative might have anglicized their name upon immigrating to a new country. Another example could be, or an example of that is carre anglicized to square. So if you're testing a family member, it's always important that you receive their consent and that they too are aware of the possible risks associated with DNA testing. So we have some other upcoming genealogy programs that you might be interested in. There's Ancestry Library Edition that's taking place on February the 15th. This program will go over the basics on navigation and the tools and resources available to you on Ancestry. Courthouse Research, taking place on March the 1st, is a program that will go over how courthouse records assist with genealogy research. This program will also go over techniques to improve your research. Primary Source Primer, March 15th. This program will highlight the use of primary source materials in your history research. And we have other additional genealogy programs. You can register for these programs and find more information at planolibrary.org. If you'd like further assistance, you can contact us through the Genealogy Center or by submitting a Book a Librarian appointment through our online portal. So that concludes our presentation. Once again, thank you for taking the time to attend our virtual program on DNA basics. You can find more resources on our website, planolibrary.org, as well as our blog, planolibrarylearns.org. So we'll open it up to a Q&A. Are there any questions?
I know we threw a lot of information at you guys, so let's see. So we had a question about what targeted tests can be used to identify when an individual is related. So if someone is a 5th to 8th cousin, would that mean connected by a great grandmother or grandfather? So with targeted testing, typically you're going to pick someone that you know is related to you, and then you're going to try to narrow it down based on what side you think they're on. So if you're targeted testing, typically you're trying to determine that real far back ancestry, you're going to test the oldest person on the side that you think that you're related to them on. And wherever you match up with them, back is going to be the earliest known relative. So that's how you can use targeted tests. A lot of times with your DNA test, you're going to match with some really far back people or very distantly related people. So the best way to use already tested people on those DNA sites is to have your genealogy tree already written out. So typically what we suggest to people is to do a genealogy tree at the same time that you're doing your DNA, because whenever you receive your DNA, it's going to be kind of a lot of information thrown at you all at once. But if you have that genealogy tree as far back as you can get it, you're going to be able to match up where people belong on that family tree. And more times than not, they might also have a genealogy tree ready. So you can see if theirs matches up with yours and kind of like that. And then we had a question about where to get the centimorgan chart. There's a couple available. If you just type in centimorgan chart on Google and click images, a lot of times they'll have a whole bunch of them listed there. So you can look there, and I'll go back to that so you guys can see that. Oops. Let's see. So there's that centimorgan chart. This one is from familysearch.org with information pulled from the geneticgenealogist.com. All right, and then we had another question to re-show the slide with the library's information, so that our contact information is going to be right there. And that's going to have the book librarian that can be useful to direct questions to us so we can help you out with your genealogy or DNA questions. And then let's see, we had we have a question about if it's not possible to have results from past family members, then the DNA result is only useful to yourself. So when you do a DNA test, you might have the chance to connect with people just outside your immediate family. And so that can be helpful to track down more extended relatives.
Like distant relatives. In that regards too, if you're not able to DNA test immediate family for whatever reason, it does help to have that, again, that genealogical family tree. So that way, if you are able to match with anybody, you can, it might be, you know, extended family, but at least you'll be able to verify those matches and potentially have access to their family trees as well, if it is a very distant relative that you match with. So even if it isn't possible to match family members for whatever reason, you can still get a lot of information just from matching yourself or testing yourself. If a female matches on the X mitochondrial DNA, is it safe to assume those matches are on the mother's side? So if a female matches on the mitochondrial, so oftentimes, well, depending with the company you test with, they won't tell you if it's a mitochondrial match or if it's an X match. That's something that you'll have to dig around. It helps to have that genealogical family tree and see if, let's say, you know, you were a cousin tested with ancestry, you tested with ancestry, and you know that that cousin falls on your mitochondrial side, like your, and you both match with somebody and you're trying to determine, well, is it an XDNA match or a mitochondrial match? It helps to kind of do a form of like ruling things out, like, okay, well, if I match with this person and they also match with my cousin who's a maternal cousin on your mother's side, then it's probably a maternal match. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's also helpful to write down a list of all the surnames that you find in your family tree and put them under different columns. So like, let's say that Thomas is a common surname on your mother's side. So if you match with someone whose last name is Thomas, you can probably assume that somewhere along the line, they're related on your maternal side. However, Thomas is a very common last name, so that's also something to be careful of. If you have a less common last name, like Stibby, you're going to be able to pinpoint that more readily on which side of the family that falls under, since it is so uncommon. And then, so if you go through that and you're matching with people and you're like, oh, I recognize that surname, they're probably on that chart, you can use that to target your testing further down that line. So we had another, I think this is related to the earlier question. If their tree shows no similar relative, would you assume that it's the 5th to 8th cousin and that you might be related with a 4th great-grandmother or grandfather? So what you can use on that, and let me go back to this. Usually with DNA testing companies, they're going to show you how many centimorgans you share with that relative. So you can look at a centimorgan chart here, and you can probably insert your score into the range of centimorgans that you see. So you can kind of start narrowing down how you might be related to them. Because like we mentioned earlier, there is some overlap with these ranges. So you can really pinpoint the ones that are going to be more likely than others. And that would be probably the easiest way to figure it out from there. It gets a little messy the further back you go, especially with something as distant as an 8th cousin, and even like a 4th time great grandparent, just because there's not a whole bunch of as DNA gets more, I guess, combined.
Also, it's almost like
you lose a lot of the ways to track it down the further back you go, because even as you can see here, we have generation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and by the 7th generation, these people here, you're going between 0 and 96 centimorgans, which is not a whole lot. So if you're going further back than that, you're going to show a lot fewer connections, unless you have a stronger connection that you connect with up in like an early generation. Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to watch our DNA basics class. As we go throughout the year, there's going to be other DNA classes available as well as various genealogy programs, as we showed you earlier, that you're more than welcome to register for. We do have basic, intermediate, and advanced for DNA. So hopefully those later classes will help you to build on what you've learned in our basics today. So thank you guys again. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us through that phone number or through the book librarian. So thank you guys. Have a great day.